The 9,451st meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. I would like to warmly welcome the Secretary General, distinguished ministers, and other high-level representatives present in the Security Council chamber. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Algeria, Argentina, Australia, Bahrain, Bangladesh, Belgium, the plurinational state of Bolivia, Cambodia, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Czechia, Egypt, Finland, Germany, Guatemala, Hungary, Iceland, India, Indonesia, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Iraq, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Jamaica, Jordan, Kazakhstan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Malaysia, Maldives, Mauritania, Mexico, Morocco, Namibia, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, Peru, the Philippines, Poland, Portugal, Qatar, the Republic of Korea, Saudi Arabia, Sierra Leone, Slovenia, Spain, South Africa, Sri Lanka, the Syrian Arab Republic, Thailand, Tunisia, Turkey, Ukraine, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and Vietnam to participate in this meeting. It's so decided. I propose that the Council invite the Minister of Foreign Affairs and expatriates of the observer state of Palestine to participate in this meeting in accordance with the provisional rules of procedure and the previous practices in this regard. There being no objection, it's so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome His Excellency Riyad al-Maliki. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provision Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Thor Venesland, the Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, and Ms. Lynn Hastings, Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Resident Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator for the Occupied Palestinian Territory. It's so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite the following individuals to participate in this meeting. His Excellency, Mr. Sheikh Nyang, Chair of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. His Excellency, Mr. Olaf Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations. And His Excellency, Mr. Ahmed Abulgait, Secretary General of the League of Arab States. It's so decided. I also propose that the Council invite His Excellency Archbishop Gabriele Caccia, Permanent Observer of the Holy See to the United Nations, to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practices in this regard. There being no objection, it's so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres.
Mr. President, with your permission, I would make a small introduction and then ask my colleagues to brief the Security Council on the situation on the ground. Excellencies, the situation in the Middle East is growing more dire by the hour. The war in Gaza is raging and risks spiraling throughout the region. Divisions are splintering societies, tensions threaten to boil over. At a crucial moment like this, it is vital to be clear on principles, starting with the fundamental principle of respecting and protecting civilians. I have condemned unequivocally the horrifying and unprecedented 7 October acts of terror by Hamas in Israel. Nothing can justify the deliberate killing, injuring, and kidnapping of civilians or the launching of rockets against civilian targets. All hostages must be treated humanely and released immediately and without conditions. And I respectfully note the presence among us of members of their families. Excellencies, it is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight have been vanishing. But the grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas, and those appalling attacks cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. Excellencies, even war has rules. We must demand that all parties uphold and respect their obligations under international humanitarian law, take constant care in the conduct of military operations to spare civilians, and respect and protect hospitals, and respect the inviolability of UN facilities, which today are sheltering more than 600,000 Palestinians. The relentless bombardment of Gaza by Israeli forces, the level of civilian casualties, and the wholesale destruction of neighborhoods continue to mount and are deeply alarming. I mourn and honor dozens of UN colleagues working for UNRWA. Sadly, at least 35 and counting, killed in the bombardment of Gaza over the last 2 weeks. I owe to their families my condemnation of these and many other similar killings. The protection of civilians is paramount in any armed conflict. Protecting civilians can never mean using them as human shields. Protecting civilians does not mean ordering more than 1 million people to evacuate to the south, where there is no shelter, no food, no water, no medicine, and no fuel, and then continuing to bomb the south itself. I am deeply concerned about the clear violations of international humanitarian law that we are witnessing in Gaza. Let me be clear, no party to an armed conflict is above international humanitarian law. Excellencies, thankfully some humanitarian relief is finally getting into Gaza, but it is a drop of aid in an ocean of need. In addition, our UN fuel supplies in Gaza will run out in a matter of days, and that would be another disaster. Without fuel, aid cannot be delivered, hospitals will not have power, and drinking water cannot be purified or even pumped. The people of Gaza need continuous aid delivery at a level that corresponds to the enormous needs, and that aid must be delivered without restrictions. I salute our UN colleagues and humanitarian partners in Gaza working under hazardous conditions and risking their lives to provide aid to those in need. They are an inspiration. To ease epic suffering, make the delivery of aid easier and safer, and facilitate the release of hostages, I reiterate my appeal for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Excellencies, even in this moment of grave and immediate danger, we cannot lose sight of the only realistic foundation for a true peace and stability, a two-state solution. Israelis must see their legitimate needs for security materialized, and Palestinians must see their legitimate aspirations for an independent state realized in line with United Nations resolution, international laws, and previous agreements. And finally, we must be clear on the principle of upholding human dignity. Polarization and dehumanization are being fueled by a tsunami of disinformation. We must stand up to the forces of anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bigotry, and all forms of hate. Mr. President, Excellencies, today is United Nations Day, marking 78 years since the UN Charter entered into force. That Charter reflects our shared commitment to advance peace, sustainable development, and human rights. On this UN Day, at this critical hour, I appeal to all to pull back from the brink before the violence claims even more lives and spreads even further. Thank you very much.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Thor Venneland.
Mr. President, Excellencies, members of the Security Council, I thank you for your sustained attention to the grave developments unfolding in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly in and around Gaza. In light of the horrific violence of these past weeks, allow me to begin by expressing my most sincere condolences to the thousands of families in Israel, Palestine, and across the globe who are in mourning, in shock, and in profound pain. This includes the families of 35 UN staff killed in Gaza. The abhorrent attack launched by Hamas on 7 October and Israel's devastating, ongoing military operation in Gaza have taken a staggering toll on civilians and deeply shaken Israelis and Palestinians alike. As I told this Council last week, and the Secretary General has just expressed, the events we are witnessing are unprecedented. They risk expanding to the wider region and may have profound long-term impact on the dynamics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Mr. President, on the morning of 7 October, Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups launched a large-scale complex assault on Israel. The unprecedented attack saw an estimated 1,500 Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad militants from Gaza infiltrate some 20 Israeli communities and military facilities in the Gaza periphery by land, sea, and air, while thousands of rockets were launched towards central Israel, including Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Testimony and evidence emerging from the tragic day reveal a sickening killing spree, designed to terrorize, with appalling scenes of brutality, massacres, hostage-taking, including against infants and young children. In all, Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups killed over 1,400 Israelis and foreign nationals, the bloodiest attack in Israel's history. This includes over 1,000 civilians, many of them women and children, and over 360 security forces personnel. Over 5,400 Israelis were injured. At least 220 civilians, including women and children, as well as soldiers, were abducted and taken into Gaza Strip as hostages. While not confirmed, Hamas has said that 22 hostages were killed by Israeli strikes. I welcome the release of 4 hostages and recognize the important role of Qatar in this regard. To the families of hostages, some of whom are with us today, the fear and uncertainties you have had to endure is unimaginable. As the Secretary General and I have said repeatedly, your loved ones must be returned to you immediately and unconditionally. Heavy fighting between Israeli forces and militants inside the Israeli communities continued until 10 October, when the Israeli Defense Forces said it regained control of the perimeter fence. Over 120,000 Israelis were displaced from the area. Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups in Gaza have continued to launch indiscriminate rocket fire from Gaza into Israel, reaching as far as north as Haifa. To date, according to Israeli sources, some 7,700 rockets have been launched. Mr. President, on the day of the attack, Israeli Security Cabinet declared a state of war for the first time in over 50 years, with the aim of, quote, the destruction of the military and governing capabilities of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, unquote. That same day, Israeli forces began a massive bombardment of what they said were Hamas sites throughout Gaza. Israeli air assaults in the Strip has continued to date, with some 5,000 such sites targeted, according to the IDF. On 8 October, Israeli Minister for Defense announced a complete siege of Gaza, blocking all entry of goods, including electricity, water, food, fuel, and medical equipment. The airstrikes have been devastating and resulted in a staggering number of Palestinian fatalities, a vast number of whom are civilians. Thus far, the Ministry of Health in Gaza has reported over 5,000 Palestinians killed, including 1,100 women, 2,000 children, as well as journalists, medical workers, and first responders, with more than 15,000 injured. Authorities estimate that hundreds more lay dead or injured under rubble as rescue effort languish amid continuous airstrike. Over 1 million Palestinians have been displaced. The level of physical destruction has left entire neighborhoods in rubble, and critical infrastructure has been destroyed or damaged. Schools, including UNRWA schools and hospitals, many sheltering displaced Palestinians, have been hit. Displacement levels are unprecedented. Compounding the destruction from airstrikes, the humanitarian impact has been immense. In this regard, I welcome Egypt's facilitation to open Rafah border crossing on 21 October and reiterate the humanitarian assistance needs to flow safely and continuously into the Strip. I echo the Secretary General's appeal for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Lynn Hastings, the humanitarian coordinator in the OPT, will report in full on the humanitarian situation on behalf of the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths. Mr. President, the risk of significant further deterioration in the situation of the occupied West Bank or spillover of the conflict in the region remain significant. Violence in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, already at worrying level, has increased since the outbreak of the war. Israeli authorities have imposed widespread movement restriction and conducted extensive arrests. High number of daily clashes and armed exchanges between Palestinians and Israeli security forces and settlers have been recorded, as well as settler-related violence and Palestinian attacks against the Israelis. Since 7 October, 93 Palestinians, including 27 children, have been killed by ISF or settlers, and 1 Israeli security personnel was killed in an armed exchange. Large demonstrations in solidarity with the Gaza population took place in cities across the West Bank, with some leading to confrontation with Palestinian security forces. Meanwhile, across the blue line and amid heightened rhetoric and actors on the ground, intermittent but intense exchanges of fire since 8 October. Hezbollah, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad have launched rockets and anti-tank missiles towards Israel, while IDF responded with artillery fire and airstrikes, leading to casualties on both sides. On 13 and 20 October, 2 journalists were killed. Palestinian militants from Lebanon have also made several infiltration attempts, the most significant on 9 October. Over 80,000 Israelis have been evacuated from homes, and some 20,000 Lebanese have been displaced. On the Golan, the Israeli Defense Forces responded on 10 October with artillery and mortar shells towards what they said were a number of launches from Syria towards Israel. Syrian state media reported Israeli air attacks on 12 and 22 October, targeting the international airports of Damascus and Aleppo, and on 14 October, Aleppo International Airport. UNDOF continued to engage with both parties, urging them to exercise maximum restraints in respect of their obligation under the 1974 Agreement on the Disengagement of Forces. Mr. President, the Secretary General has been very clear in expressing the UN condemnation of the horrific attacks by Hamas and others on 7 October and deep alarm over the scale of Israeli airstrikes and the scope of civilian casualties and destruction in Gaza. Over this past week, the Secretary General and I have been pursuing any and every opportunity to address the situation on the ground and to prevent further civilian death and misery. It is critical that we, as a united international community, employ all our collective efforts to end the bloodletting and prevent the further expansion of hostilities, including in the region. The stakes are astronomically high, and I appeal for all relevant actors to act responsibly. Any miscalculation could have immeasurable consequences. In this regard, I welcome Egypt's convening of the Cairo Peace Summit on 21 October and the efforts of the state in the region and beyond to address the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe before us and to pave the way for unlocking a real and serious peace process. Mr. President, these devastating events are not divorced from the broader context of the occupied Palestinian territory, Israel, and the region, where dynamics are deeply intertwined. The unresolved conflict and continued occupation shape the reality of every Israeli and every Palestinian. For 15 years, the Palestinian population have been living under militant rule and a strict closure regime as the Palestinian divide hardened. For a generation, hope has been lost, and despair has prevailed for those who see prospect for a more peaceful future pulling still further away. Only a political solution will move us forward. The steps we take to address these crises must be implemented in a way that ultimately advances a negotiated peace and fulfills the legitimate national aspiration of Palestinians and Israelis, the long-held vision of two states in line with UN resolution, international law, and previous agreements. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Venesland for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Mrs. Lynn Hastings.
Mr. President, thank you for this opportunity to update the Security Council on behalf of Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths. At the outset, I want to welcome the release of 2 hostages on Saturday and another 2 yesterday. We are grateful to the Arab Republic of Egypt and the Emir of Qatar for mediating their release, and to the International Committee of Red Cross for facilitating. However, the more than 200 hostages still being held must be released without condition or any further delay. We welcome all diplomatic efforts to secure their release and demand that, in the interim, they be treated humanely and be allowed to receive visits from the ICRC. As intense airstrikes continue to rain down on Gaza, and as indiscriminate rockets fly into Israel, death, injury, destruction, and displacement are mounting. On the Israeli side, the fatality toll is more than 3 times the cumulative number of Israelis killed since OCHA began recording casualties in 2005. In Gaza, the reported Palestinian fatality toll of the past 17 days is more than double the total number of fatalities of the entire 2014, a war which lasted 50 days. Women and children comprise some 62% of these victims. The number of those who are internally displaced has swelled to 1.4 million. Nearly 600,000 people are sheltering in UNRWA facilities in increasingly dire conditions. The average number of IDPs per shelter has reached 2.5 times the capacity. As my colleagues have repeatedly highlighted, there is nowhere to seek refuge in Gaza. When it comes to decisions on whether and where to flee, civilians are damned if they do and damned if they don't. Displaced families are reportedly returning to North Gaza due to ongoing bombardments because their basic needs, including safety, cannot be met in the south. I reiterate that civilians must be protected and have the essentials they need to survive, whether they move or if they stay. To give you an idea of the scale of destruction, according to the Gaza Ministry of Housing, at least 42% of all housing units in the Strip have already been either destroyed or damaged since October 7th. The scale of destruction calls into question the ability of people to ever return to their homes. Meanwhile, Gaza remains under a full electricity blackout. Hospitals are on the brink of collapse due to shortages of electricity, medicine, equipment, specialized personnel, and the damage and destruction. Patients are being treated on the floors due to a shortage of beds. Doctors are being forced to operate without anesthesia. Since the 7th of October, 16 health workers in Gaza have reportedly been killed and 30 injured while on duty. Mr. President, in the middle of this tumult, the agreement to use Rafah crossing from Egypt to get essential humanitarian supplies into Gaza has provided a glimmer of hope to people living in the appalling conditions. This past weekend, 34 trucks entered Gaza with life-saving supplies, and another 20 crossed Rafah into Gaza yesterday. 20 more of those are due to cross today. We welcome this important development, and we pledge to do our part to ensure these deliveries increase and continue. But these deliveries are a drop in the bucket compared to the vast scale of needs. They amount to no more than 4% of the daily average volume of commodities entering Gaza prior to these hostilities. Needs are now, of course, significantly greater. And most crucially, the deliveries made over the past few days do not include fuel. That is essential for powering the services that are needed for people to survive. Without fuel, our humanitarian operation will stop. No fuel means no hospitals functioning, no desalination of water, and no baking. Many people are drinking saline groundwater, increasing the risks of diarrhea, cholera, and other health issues. We urge Israel to bring water and electricity supplies back to pre-conflict levels and to work with us to find a secure way of bringing fuel into Gaza. While we negotiate with the government of Israel as to how best to bring fuel into Gaza, we have 400,000 liters of trucks ready to go. This would provide fuel for approximately 2.5 more days. If the civilians across Gaza are to get access to adequate food, water, medical care, and other essential supplies, we must be able to scale up deliveries of all goods, and we must be able to replenish fuel supplies. It will be important also that the Israeli crossings for the movement of people and goods are opened. I want to express my utmost admiration for the bravery and extraordinary commitment of those delivering life-saving and humanitarian services in Gaza. This includes the incredible staff at UNRWA, many of whom are displaced themselves and who continue to support the most vulnerable despite it all. We must also pay tribute to the 35 UNRWA colleagues who have tragically been killed. I urge the Council to redouble funding to UNRWA and other humanitarian agencies on the ground without delay so they can continue these indispensable efforts. Mr. President, today of all days, when we celebrate the United Nations, we must all continue to demand respect for international humanitarian law. The parties on all sides must take constant care to spare civilians, including medical and humanitarian personnel, civilian objects, including homes, hospitals, and humanitarian assets. Civilians must have the essentials to survive, and to this end, the passage of rapid and unimpeded and increased humanitarian relief must be facilitated and water and electricity connections resumed. I urge all countries with influence to exert it and ensure respect for the rules of war. Mr. President, agreement on the resumption of aid deliveries and the release of a small number of hostages over the past few days shows that through diplomacy and negotiations, humanity can prevail, and we can find humanitarian solutions, even in the depths of this conflict. In this spirit, I reiterate the Secretary General's call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to ease this epic human suffering. If we are to prevent any further descent into this humanitarian catastrophe, dialogue must continue to ensure essential supplies can get into Gaza at the scale needed, to spare civilians and the infrastructure they depend on, to release hostages, and to avoid any further escalation and spillover. The world is looking to the